Commander Alara Vance stepped off the transport ship and took her first breath of recycled station air. And the smell hit her immediately, a strange mix of metal and alien spices, and something she could not name. Something that told her she was very far from Earth Station Veth 9 was everything the briefings had promised and more. A massive ring of metal and glass floating in the void between 3 solar systems. Home to over 2 million beings from dozens of different species. And now her home for the next 3 years as Earth's new diplomatic attaché. She walked through the arrival terminal with her single bag over her shoulder, watching the chaos of the galaxy's largest trading hub unfold around her. And she had never felt so small in her entire life. Towering Velthari merchants moved through the crowds like living mountains, their blue-gray skin catching the artificial light as they conducted business in voices that rumbled like thunder. And Alara had to step quickly to avoid being crushed beneath feet the size of ground cars. The crystalline Shenkai floated past in their gravity harnesses, their bodies made of living mineral that sang with each movement, creating a music that was beautiful and completely alien. And they did not even glance at the tiny human watching them with wide eyes. Insectoid Vrex clicked and chattered in groups, their compound eyes reflecting everything at once, their mandibles never still as they argued over prices and territories in a language that sounded like breaking glass, and everywhere between them moved smaller creature service workers and traders and diplomats from 100 different worlds, each one stranger than the last, each one reminding Alara that humanity was still a new species here, still the outsiders trying to earn their place at the galactic table. Her guide was a Velthari named Desik, who would also serve as her counterpart in the diplomatic corps. And he looked down at her with something that might have been amusement or might have been contempt. She was still learning to read their expressions. "Welcome to Veth 9, Commander Vance," Desik said, his voice making her chest vibrate with its depth. "I trust your journey was acceptable." "It was fine, thank you," Alara replied, keeping her voice steady and professional even though her heart was racing with excitement and fear in equal measure. Desik led her through the marketplace toward the diplomatic quarter, explaining the layout of the station and the various protocols she would need to follow. And Alara tried to listen while also taking in everything around her. That was when she saw it, a small creature, no larger than a house cat, with 6 legs and dull gray fur that seemed designed to blend into shadows, and 4 black eyes that gleamed with reflected light as it watched the marketplace from beneath a merchant's stall. Alara stopped walking. Desik continued for several steps before realizing she was no longer beside him, and he turned back with obvious irritation. "Commander, we have a schedule to maintain." "What is that creature?" Alara asked, pointing toward the shadow where the small beast crouched. Desik barely glanced in that direction before making a sound of dismissal. "A Karks, nothing more. Vermin that infest every station and colony in the sector. Pay it no attention." As if to prove his point, a Shenkai merchant drifted past the stall, and its gravity field knocked the small Karks tumbling across the floor. And the crystalline being did not even pause or acknowledge what had happened. The Karks scrambled back to its feet and retreated deeper into the shadows. And Alara watched it go with a strange feeling growing in her chest. "They are pests," Desik continued, already walking again and clearly expecting her to follow. "Scavengers that steal food and small items, barely above animals in intelligence. We tolerate them only because exterminating them proved more trouble than simply ignoring them." Alara followed her guide, but she kept watching the shadows, and she saw more of them now that she knew what to look for: small gray shapes moving at the edges of vision. Always watching, always silent. Something about them made her deeply uneasy. And it took her most of the walk to the diplomatic quarter to understand why it was the way they moved. Not the scurrying panic of rats or the mindless wandering of insects, but something more deliberate, more purposeful. The movement of creatures that were going somewhere specific for reasons they understood, and their eyes. Those 4 black eyes that seemed to track, not just movement, but meaning. Watching the merchants and the traders and the diplomats with an attention that felt far too focused for simple animals. Ilara had seen eyes like that before. When she finally reached her quarters and Desik left her to settle in, she did not unpack her bag or explore her new home. Instead, she sat down at her terminal and accessed Earth's historical archives. She searched for hours, pulling up footage and studies and reports that most people had forgotten existed. Records of creatures that humanity had once dismissed as mere animals. Wolves working together to bring down prey 10 times their size. Communicating through postures and sounds that researchers had taken decades to decode. Corvids, crows, and ravens solving puzzles that stumped other species. Using tools, remembering human faces for years. Teaching their children which humans to trust and which to fear. Chimpanzees and bonobos learning sign language. Expressing abstract thoughts, mourning their dead. Waging wars and further back, millions of years into the past. Small primates watching the larger predators from the safety of trees, learning, adapting, waiting for their moment. Every one of those species had been underestimated, dismissed as lesser creatures by beings who could not see what they were becoming, who could not recognize the spark of something more hiding behind. Animal eyes. Ilara thought about the Kurks crouching in the shadows of the marketplace, watching everything with those 4 black eyes. And she felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen this before. Humanity had lived this before. They had been the small creatures once, the ones that larger predators ignored because they seemed too weak and too simple to matter. And look what humanity had become. Ilara pulled up her personal log and began recording her observations, knowing that she might be wrong, hoping that she was wrong, but unable to shake the feeling that everyone on this station was making a terrible mistake. The Karks were watching, and no one seemed to care, but Ilara knew, she knew in her bones with the certainty of someone whose species had walked this exact path, the creatures who watched. Like that were creatures who learned, and creatures who learned eventually stopped hiding in the shadows. 3 months passed on Station Beth 9, and Ilara Vance became known as the human who watched the vermin. She did not care what they called her behind her back, did not care about the amused glances from Velthari diplomats or the dismissive clicks from Vrex traders, because she had seen too much to stop now. Every day she walked through the marketplace with a datapad in her hand, recording everything the Kurks did. And every day she became more certain that she was right about them. They were not random scavengers. They were organized. She had documented over 50 individual Kurks by now, learning to tell them apart by the patterns in their fur and the small scars on their bodies. And she had watched them work together in ways that made her heart race with excitement and fear. When a merchant left their stall unattended, one Kurx would position itself where it could see the returning owner while another moved to take what they needed. And they communicated through movements of their antennae, small twitches and waves that clearly meant something. A language of gesture that no one had ever bothered to decode. Ilara had started to learn it. 2 antennae up meant safe. 1 up and 1 down meant wait. Both antennae flat against the head meant danger. And there were dozens of other signals for concepts she was still working to understand. She had watched a young Kurx struggle to open a sealed food container for nearly an hour before an older Kurx approached and showed it how to use a broken piece of metal as a lever. And then the young one practiced the technique again and again until it could do it alone. Teaching. Ilara thought, that is teaching. That is the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. And that changes everything. She brought her findings to Ambassador Desik during their weekly meeting, spreading her data across the table with barely contained excitement. Look at this, she said, pointing to her charts and recordings. They have a communication system. They use tools. They teach their young. This is not the behavior of simple animals. Desek looked at her evidence for approximately 3 seconds before pushing it aside. Commander Vance, I have tolerated your strange hobby because humans are new to galactic society, and I assumed you would eventually grow bored. But this is becoming an embarrassment. Ambassador, if you would just look at the data. I have looked, Desek interrupted, his deep voice carrying a note of warning, and I see a human who has allowed sentiment to cloud her judgment. The Kurreks are vermin. They have been vermin for the entire recorded history of this station, and your insistence on treating them as something more reflects poorly on your species. Alara gathered her data and left without another word, her jaw tight with frustration, but she did not give up. She requested a formal audience with the Galactic Council. The chamber was enormous, built to accommodate species of vastly different sizes, and Alara felt very small standing at the speaker's platform while representatives from a dozen different species looked down at her with varying degrees of interest and impatience. She presented her evidence carefully, showing the communication patterns and the tool use and the teaching behaviors, making her case as clearly as she could. The Shankai representative was the first to respond, its crystalline voice ringing through the chamber like struck glass. We have analyzed your data and calculated the cognitive quotient of the Kurreks based on standard galactic metrics. The result is 7 on the sentient scale. While below the threshold for recognition as an intelligent species, your metrics might be wrong, Alara said, knowing she was pushing too hard but unable to stop herself. Or they might not measure the right things. A ripple of what she could only interpret as offense moved through the assembly. The Vrex collective representative clicked its mandibles in what sounded like laughter. The human suggests that our methods, refined over 10,000 years, are inferior to her 3 months of observation. Perhaps her species is even younger than we realized. Alara felt her face flush with anger but kept her voice steady. On Earth, there was a time when we looked at wolves and saw only threats to our livestock. We looked at great apes and saw only animals. We were wrong. Every species that watched and learned and adapted was on a path towards something more, and we nearly destroyed them before we understood. A touching story, the Velthri representative rumbled. But irrelevant, your Earth creatures are not Kurreks. And your human guilt about past mistakes does not mean these vermin deserve elevation. The council voted unanimously to dismiss her concerns, and Alara walked out of the chamber feeling like she had failed not just herself, but an entire species that could not speak for themselves. She wandered the station for hours after that, too frustrated to return to her quarters, too angry to face her colleagues. And eventually she found herself in a quiet corridor, near the maintenance section where few beings ever came. That was when she heard it, a small sound, barely audible, coming from behind a ventilation grate. Alara crouched down and looked through the metal slats, and a pair of black eyes looked back at her. Kurreks, smaller than most she had documented, sat just inside the vent with something clutched in its small paws. And it did not run away when she moved closer. Instead, it held up the object it was carrying, pushing it toward the grate so she could see it clearly, a translator badge, the kind that diplomats wore to communicate across language barriers, clearly stolen from someone who had not noticed its absence. The Kurreks pressed the badge with one careful paw, and static crackled from the tiny speaker. And then a voice emerged, broken and rough and barely understandable, but unmistakably intentional. Friend? Alara felt the world shift beneath her feet. She stared at the small creature holding stolen technology, using it to speak a word it must have heard thousands of times in the marketplace. A word it had chosen specifically because it understood what it meant. Yes, she whispered, her voice shaking with the weight of what was happening. Yes, I am your friend. the Currix made a sound she had never heard before. A soft chirping that might have been relief or might have been joy. And its antennae moved in a pattern she did not yet know, but she would learn everything. Because this changed everything, and the galaxy was going to have to listen whether it wanted to or not. Alara called the small Currix Whisper because of the soft sounds it made when trying to communicate. And over the following weeks, Whisper became her guide into a world she had never imagined existed. It started with small meetings in quiet corridors, with Whisper bringing her stolen objects that told stories data, chips and broken tools and scraps of writing from a dozen different species. Each one proof that the Currix collected more than just food. Then one night, Whisper led her to a maintenance hatch that had been carefully hidden behind stacked cargo containers. And with a gesture of its antennae that clearly meant follow, the small creature disappeared into the darkness. Below, Alara hesitated for only a moment before climbing down after it. The maintenance tunnels of Station Veth 9 were a maze of pipes and cables and forgotten passages that the station's official residents never saw. And Whisper moved through them with the confidence of someone traveling a well-known road. They walked for nearly an hour, moving deeper and deeper into the station's infrastructure, passing through thermal vents that made Alara sweat and cold sections that made her shiver, until finally they emerged into a space that stopped her heart. It was a cavern, not a natural one, but something that had been carved out of the station's structure over what must have been decades or centuries. A hollow space hidden in the gaps between official sections, lit by bioluminescent fungi that the Currix had clearly cultivated on purpose, and it was full of Currix, thousands of them, moving through structures built from salvaged materials, living in a society that no one on the station above knew existed. Alara stood at the entrance and stared with tears forming in her eyes. Because she had been right. She had been so terribly right. And the truth was even bigger than she had imagined. The structures were crude but functional platforms and walkways made from scrap metal. Walls built from compressed waste materials. Everything organized into what looked like neighborhoods and gathering spaces and specialized areas for different purposes. Whisper tugged at her hand and led her deeper into this hidden world. And everywhere Alara looked, she saw evidence of a civilization in its early stages. There were areas where Currix worked together to repair stolen technology, passing tools and sharing knowledge with a coordination that would have been impressive in any species. There were spaces that looked like markets, where Currix exchanged items and services using a system of trade that Alara could not yet understand but clearly recognized as an economy. There were what could only be called schools, where older Currix gathered young ones around them and made complex patterns with their antennae, while the children watched with intense concentration, learning a language that had never been written down but had been passed from generation to generation for centuries. An elderly Currix approached them, its fur gray with age and its movements slow but dignified. And it looked at Alara with eyes that held no fear, only curiosity and something that might have been hope. Whisper made introductions, using a combination of antenna signals and carefully selected stolen translator phrases. And Alara understood that this elder was a leader of some kind, a keeper of knowledge and history. The elder led her to what Whisper's broken translations called the learning place, and what Alara saw there made her legs feel weak. It was a library. The walls were covered with stolen data chips, and written documents and even hand-carved symbols in the Currix's own emerging written language. And young Currix sat in groups studying these materials, with the intensity of university students preparing for examinations. Whisper explained, in halting translated words, that the Currix had been collecting knowledge for as long as anyone could remember, learning to read the languages of the species that ignored them, piecing together understanding from garbage and lost items and overheard conversations. They knew 17 different languages now, Whisper said, and they understood how trade worked and how politics worked and how technology worked. Even if they could not yet build technology of their own, they knew so much. And no one had ever asked them what they knew. The elder made a long series of antenna movements that Whisper struggled to translate. But Alara understood the essence of it. The Kuriks knew they were despised, knew they were considered vermin, knew that the galaxy would never accept them if they revealed themselves now. So they waited in the darkness, learning and growing and hoping that someday things would be different. Alara felt something break inside her chest, a wall she had not known she was holding up. And she knelt down so she was at eye level with the elder. "I will help you," she said. And Whisper translated, "I will find a way to make them see what I see." The elder's antennae moved in a pattern that Whisper said meant gratitude and trust, and something else that did not translate but felt like the weight of a species. Placing their hope in a single human, then Whisper led her to another chamber, smaller and more secret than the others, where Karik's analysts had been doing something that made Alara's blood run cold. They had been monitoring the station's communications, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to catch fragments and patterns that their emerging intelligence could piece together into meaning. And what they had found was terrifying. The Rex Collective was planning something. Weapon shipments that did not appear on official manifests. Communication bursts that used encryption the Kuriks had partially cracked. Troop movements disguised as trade. Delegations, all of it pointing toward a coordinated action during the upcoming Unity Festival, when security would be relaxed and all the major diplomats would be gathered in one place. The Kuriks had been trying to warn someone for months, Whisper explained. But who would listen to vermin? Who would take their warnings seriously? Who would believe that creatures kicked aside in the marketplace had uncovered a conspiracy that threatened everyone on the station? No one. Alara realized. No one except a human who already knew they were more than they appeared. "Show me everything," she said. And Whisper's antennae rose in a pattern that meant hope, real hope. For the first time in the conversation, "Show me everything, and together we will make them listen." Alara spent 3 days with the Kurik's analysts, learning everything they had discovered about the Vrex conspiracy. And when she finally climbed back up to the station's official levels, she carried enough evidence to prevent a massacre, or so she believed. She requested an emergency session with the Galactic Council, using every bit of diplomatic privilege Earth's position allowed. And when she stood before the assembled representatives, she felt ready for the battle ahead. "The Vrex Collective is planning to seize this station," she said without any greeting or ceremony. "They have been smuggling weapons aboard for months. They have positioned soldiers disguised as traders throughout the diplomatic quarter. And they intend to strike during the Unity Festival, when all of you will be gathered in one location." Silence followed her words. And then the clicking laughter of the Vrex representative filled the chamber. "This is absurd," the insectoid said, its compound eyes glittering with what Alara now recognized as malice hidden behind amusement. "The human makes wild accusations without any credible evidence." "I have evidence," Alara replied. And she transmitted the files to every display in the chamber communication. Intercepts and shipping manifests and troop movement analyses. All of it carefully compiled and cross-referenced. The representatives studied the data with varying degrees of interest. And Alara felt hope rising in her chest until the Shenkai spoke. Where did this information come from? Alara took a deep breath, knowing what would happen next, but seeing no way around the truth from the Kuriks. The laughter was immediate and overwhelming, coming from nearly every species in the chamber. And Alara stood in the middle of it with her hands clenched at her sides. "Vermin," the Vulthari representative rumbled between deep chuckles. "The human expects us to believe that vermin have infiltrated Vrex communications. conducted intelligence analysis, and uncovered a conspiracy that our own security forces have missed. Yes, Alara said. Because they have. They have been watching all of you for centuries, learning your languages and understanding your systems. And they see things that you miss because you never bother to look at them. The Vrex representative clicked its mandibles in exaggerated offense. This is not only absurd, it is insulting. The human accuses my collective of conspiracy based on the alleged claims of creatures we sweep from our meal halls. I demand a formal apology. I will not apologize for telling the truth. Then you will face consequences, the Vrex said. Earth is still a junior member of this assembly, and your species cannot afford to make enemies. Ambassador Thesic rose from his position in the observation area, his massive form drawing every eye in the chamber. I apologize on behalf of Commander Vance, he said in his deep rumbling voice. She has become obsessed with these creatures, and it has clearly affected her judgment. I will ensure she receives the help she needs. I am not crazy, Alara said. But a voice was lost in the murmur of agreement that followed Thesic's words. The council voted to dismiss her claims, and Thesic escorted her from the chamber with a grip on her arm that was just short of painful. You have destroyed yourself, he said once they were in the corridor, and you have damaged Earth's reputation in ways that will take years to repair. I hope you are satisfied. They are going to kill everyone, Alara said. The Vrex are going to wait until the Unity Festival, and they are going to kill every diplomat on this station, including you, and you are too proud to listen. Thesic released her arm and stepped back, his expression unreadable. I think you should return to your quarters and stay there until we decide what to do with you. He walked away without looking back, and Alara stood alone in the empty corridor, feeling the weight of her failure pressing down on her shoulders. She had tried to work within the system, tried to follow the rules, tried to make them listen through proper channels. And it had not been enough. It would never be enough, because they would never listen to evidence that came from creatures they considered less than nothing. Alara walked to her quarters slowly, her mind racing through possibilities and finding none of them acceptable. And when she arrived, she sat down at her terminal and stared at the blank screen for a long time. She thought about her career, everything she had worked for, her position as Earth's representative in a galaxy that barely respected her species at all. She thought about what would happen if she was wrong, if the Kurix had somehow misunderstood what they had seen, if she threw away everything for nothing. And she thought about the thousands of Kurix living in the darkness below the station, building a civilization out of garbage and hope, trusting her to be the voice they could not yet have. And she thought about the Unity Festival, 3 days away, where every diplomat and leader on the station would gather in one place, vulnerable, unprotected, because no one believed the threat was real. There was no choice. Not really. Alara opened a secure channel to Earth Command and transmitted everything, the Kurix evidence, her observations, her conclusions about what was coming, and a request for any human security forces in the sector to converge on station. Veth 9 immediately. Then she descended into the maintenance tunnels to find Whisper. The council will not help us, she said, when she reached the hidden cavern. But I will not let your people's warning go unheard. If we cannot convince them with words, then we will have to save them with actions. Whisper's antennae rose in the pattern that meant hope, and behind them the Kurix elders gathered to hear what the human had planned. We are going to need everything you know about this station, Alara said. Every passage, every system, every secret that you have discovered in your centuries of watching. The elder stepped forward and made a gesture that Whisper translated as complete commitment, total trust, the promise of a species placing its future in her hands. And when this is over, Alara added, a voice steady with determination, they are going to know who saved them. They are going to know your names. The Unity Festival began with music and lights and speeches about cooperation between species. And Alara watched from a maintenance corridor as the galaxy's leaders gathered in the Grand Assembly Hall without any idea of what was coming. She was not alone. Whisper crouched beside her, antennae moving constantly as it received signals from Kurix, positioned throughout the station. And behind them waited the small human security team that had arrived on a fast transport just hours before. 12 soldiers who had been told only that they were responding to a credible threat against the station. Alara had not told them who had provided the intelligence. Not yet. The Vrex are moving, Whisper said through the stolen translator, its voice clearer now after weeks of practice. They approached from 6 directions. Alara checked her datapad and saw the Kurix reports flowing in from every section of the station. A real-time map of the enemy's movements that no official security system had detected. Are your people ready? Whisper's antennae formed the pattern that meant absolute certainty. We have waited for this moment for a very long time. The Vrex struck exactly as the Kurix had predicted. Coordinated teams moving through the station toward the assembly hall from multiple angles, expecting to find doors unlocked and security systems blind. They found neither. Every door on their planned routes had been sealed from the inside, locked by small gray paws that knew the station systems better than the engineers who had built them. And when the Vrex tried to use their hacking tools, they found that the access codes had been changed hours before. The Vrex communication network erupted with confusion and fury, and Alara listened to it through the Kurix intercept system with grim satisfaction. They are trying to reroute, Whisper reported. But every path they choose has already been blocked. Good. Now Phase 2. Throughout the station, ventilation grates opened and Kurix emerged by the hundreds, carrying stolen shock prods and salvaged restraining cords. And they fell upon the scattered Vrex soldiers with the coordination of a species that had been preparing for this moment in the darkness for generations. The Vrex were larger and stronger and better armed, but they had never imagined that the vermin beneath their feet could fight back. And that moment of shock and disbelief was all the Kurix needed. Alara watched the reports flowing in as Vrex soldiers were disabled and restrained throughout the station. And she felt something fierce and proud burning in her chest, not for herself, but for the creatures who had earned this victory through centuries of patience and preparation. The main force is converging on the assembly hall, Whisper said. They still believe they can complete their mission. Then let us show them they are wrong. Alara led her small team through passages that only the Kurix knew existed, moving through the station's hidden arteries toward the point where the largest Vrex force would attempt their final assault. They emerged behind the enemy just as the Vrex breached the assembly hall doors. And what happened next was brief and brutal and decisive. The Vrex had expected to face panicked diplomats and minimal security. Instead, they found themselves caught between human soldiers who had positioned themselves perfectly using Kurix intelligence and swarms of small gray creatures who attacked from every shadow and ventilation shaft. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes when it was over. The Vrex strike force was contained, and the assembly hall was secure. And the galaxy's leaders stood in stunned silence, looking at the impossible scene before them. Kurix everywhere. Hundreds of them, standing alongside human soldiers who were treating them as allies and equals. And at the center of it all, Alara Vance with a small gray creature perched on her shoulder. What is the meaning of this? The Shenkai representative demanded, its crystalline voice ringing with confusion and something that might have been fear. The meaning, Alara said, is that you are about to die, all of you. And you are only alive right now because creatures you called vermin cared enough to save you anyway. She told them everything then. The whole truth about the Kurix and their hidden civilization and their centuries of patient watching and learning. And for once the council was silent. Ambassador Desik stepped forward, his massive form moving with unusual hesitation. And he looked at Whisper with an expression Elara had never seen on his face before. Humility. "You knew about the attack," he said. "You tried to warn us." Whisper's antennae moved in an affirmative pattern. And then it spoke through the translator in a voice that carried clearly through the silent hall. "We have always watched. We have always learned. We hoped that someday you would see us as we truly are. But we could not wait any longer, not when you were in danger." The Crystal and Shenkai representative floated forward, its calculations clearly reorganizing everything it thought it knew. "Our metrics were wrong," it admitted. "Our methods did not account for intelligence that develops in shadow. That expresses itself in patience and observation rather than technology and conquest. Intelligence comes in many forms." Elara said, "My species nearly destroyed ourselves before we learned that lesson. I hoped the galaxy might learn it more gently." In the hours that followed, as the Vrex conspirators were taken into custody and the station slowly returned to normal, the Galactic Council held an emergency session unlike any in its history. Elara stood at the speaker's platform with Whisper beside her, and she made the formal request she had been preparing since the moment she first saw a small gray creature watching from the shadows. Humanity nominates the Kurix for provisional species recognition. They have demonstrated intelligence, culture, language, and social organization. They have protected this station and everyone in it. They have earned their voice. The vote was not unanimous. Some species were too proud or too ashamed to admit how wrong they had been. But it was enough. The Kurix would have a seat at the table, a voice in the assembly, a future beyond the shadows where they had been forced to hide for so long. Whisper addressed the council as the first official Kurix representative, and its words were simple but carried the weight of centuries. "We watched because we had no choice. We learned because we hoped someday we would have a place in the light. Today you have given us that place. We will try to be worthy of it." Years later, after the Kurix had built their own technology and established their own colonies and become respected members of galactic society, a young Velthari asked an elder why the humans had been the only species to see the Kurix for what they truly were. The elder thought about the question for a long time before answering, because humans remember what it was like to be small, to be overlooked, to be underestimated by creatures who could not imagine that anything significant could come from such weak and vulnerable beings. They recognized the Kurix because they recognized themselves, and in the Kurix histories that were now written and studied and celebrated, the human Elara Vance was remembered as the one who looked into the shadows and saw not vermin but potential, not pests but people, not something to be ignored but something to be respected. She was remembered as the first friend, and her name would never be forgotten as long as the Kurix had voices to speak it.